Unity ministers are fortunate in one respect, at least, in that they do not have to adhere to the rigors of obligatory preaching. Nobody tells me what to say on Sunday morning. Now, this is sometimes a huge relief, sometimes a concern. But basically speaking, this is our fundamental textbook in Unity, the Bible. Basically speaking, I can range over its contents at will. And I wanted to share with you this morning a story that we sometimes neglect, that we sometimes pass over. We're all familiar with the Annunciation. Mary is told that she is going to bear the child Jesus. But sometimes we skip over a little bit of a prequel. It's in the Gospel of Luke, and it tells us about Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth, who is to be the mother of John, very important figure in Jesus' life. And I'm not going to read the entire story to you because it's quite lengthy. But basically, Zechariah and Elizabeth are along in years. Nobody knows precisely how old they were, but they were along in years, assumedly past conventional childbearing age for Elizabeth. And yet one day, an angel, a divine thought, perhaps, appears in Zechariah's mind and tells him that he and Elizabeth shall have a child. Well, he's skeptical. In the original Greek of the Testament, the word is rendered dubious. He's dubious about the possibility, because both of them have acknowledged the unlikelihood of ever having a child. And Zechariah remains dubious, doubtful. And so he's struck dumb, interestingly enough. You can read the story in the first chapter of Luke. But Elizabeth accepts the possibility that even at this late stage in her life, she may, in fact, bear a child. And the words I would share are these. After a while, Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she lived in seclusion, thinking, "This is the Lord's doing, which I have accepted." Now, as I say, this is not a particularly popular story in Scripture, and we tend to pass over it because we want to get to the apparently more important announcement to Mary that she shall bear Jesus. And yet, within the heart of this simple story, there is an extraordinary message, a powerful message, that goes straight to the heart of our unity thinking and teaching. Right to the core of what it means to be spiritually aware in this world. For we see here a distinction between two words, acknowledgement and acceptance. Now, this distinction was first brought to my attention when I was a kid of about 6 years of age. My father, who believed in involving me in all his major decision-making, he was kind of an old-fashioned parent, but he thought that if I wasn't with him when he made decisions, I would never grow up, which was probably true. Not sure I've grown up now, but that's beside the point. He did his best, bless his heart. But at the age of about 6, he took me to an attorney's office to witness the consummation of some deal. I think it was the purchase of some property. And the attorney that we went to had drawn up a legal instrument. We waited in, I remember very clearly, an anteroom before we were ushered into the presence of the great legal mind. And he was there presiding behind a very large desk. It was an entirely Dickensian scene. One expected a clerk with a quill pen to appear. The attorney wore a high collar. Have you seen those in the old movies? A high, stiff collar. He was very formal, and he had the instrument there, the document, the legal document. And I remember him very clearly saying to my father, "Do you acknowledge the contents of this?" And my dad said yes, he'd read it. And the attorney said, "Well, now we will make sure that you accept it." And he reached into his desk drawer. I can remember it now. He reached into his desk drawer and he withdrew a pencil of wax. Have you ever seen a stick of wax? Disastrous to introduce a child of 6 to the powers of wax and a match. Think of the possibilities. He took this pencil of wax, lighted it from a lucifer, and dropped dots of wax on a ribbon that was placed across the document. And then when this was done, he put a stamp upon it, and he reminded my dad. He said, "Now you have accepted this." Dad said, yes, that was the end of the deal. Nothing could have brought to my attention more forcibly. After all, a literal demonstration of the truth is always better than an abstract one, is it not? This literal demonstration of the truth, that there had been a process of acknowledgement, but there was also to come a process of acceptance. These were steps, I understood, that had to be followed before the document was validated. Now, it's true, some of you may say still, well, aren't you dancing on the head of a pin here? I mean, is there really that great a distinction between acknowledgement and acceptance? Yes, there is. Acknowledgement came into the English language fairly late. I think Shakespeare was the first to use the word, probably in the 1590s, in an appalling play called Titus Andronicus, that is rarely, if ever, performed. But the word acknowledgement appears there. And it meant to notice the possible existence of some phenomenon outside ourselves. I mean, I can see a tree out there, and I acknowledge a certain shape, the color of its leaves, and that's it. A mere acknowledgement. Now, if I accept that tree as a living, breathing thing, as an entity that is important in beautifying our campus, an entity that I might cause to be removed, much to the fury of the congregation and the irritation of the city fathers, well, that's a different matter altogether. We've moved, you see, into an entirely different realm of thinking. Acknowledgement versus acceptance. Acceptance is a much older word. It dates back, I think, to probably the 14th century. I think Chaucer used it in the 1300s. But acceptance means to take on board something, to internalize it, we would say in our ugly modern idiom, to internalize it, to make it part of ourselves. See, we can acknowledge a lot of things, a huge number of things, because we've got eyes and ears. We see and we hear. We in Unity are not daft. We're not living in another world. We see, we hear, we have television sets, we have diddly-do tablets, gizmos as I call them, much to my wife's irritation. we are often obliged to acknowledge situations in our lives, even in our bodies and affairs. But does that mean we have to accept them? You see, the distinction is there. It is present between mere acknowledgement and acceptance. Acceptance confers a status on events. It means that we take them into ourselves, that we internalize them and proclaim their validity and their essential existence. And this truth, for such it is, this truth is at the heart of our unity message. It really is. What we proclaim and affirm as true is far more likely to manifest in our lives than something we merely acknowledge in passing. And we have that capacity that we share with our own Maker. This is the image likeness that is referred to and misunderstood so often. The image likeness is not a human image likeness. It's not an old man with a white beard. God forbid. The image likeness we share with our Maker is the capacity to create, to make. We are able to mold. As our founders used to say, we're able to mold that which is around us by the power of our thinking and by the force of our heartfelt desire. That's acceptance. I told at the earlier services a story of a woman of whom I'm sure some of you have heard. I was gratified at the first service to realize how many people had heard of her. Florence Nightingale. Who's heard of Florence Nightingale? Yes, bless her heart. The founder of the modern nursing profession, one might say. Florence Nightingale was a distant relative of my own mother's. Many people don't realize she died until 1910. She lived until 1910. She was in her 90s, I think, when she passed away. But my mother remembers, or did remember, being taken to see her. My mother was born in... Gosh, if my mother were here, she would tremble at this point. She would be peeved. But I can reveal her birth date now that she's passed into the realm of eternity. She's born in 1900. And she was about 10 when she was taken to see Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale's a remarkable woman, extraordinary woman, one of those great 19th century women who changed the entire face of society through her courage and through her unwillingness to put up with injustice in any form whatsoever. In the 1850s, there was a war. The French and the British were fighting the Russians. Guess where? The Crimea. Because the Russians wanted the Crimea. And, well, we won't go into that. It was a terrible war. It was a terrible war. And Russians and British and French troops were dying in their hundreds and thousands from largely preventable diseases, typhoid fever, things of that nature, which were due largely to unsanitary conditions. Florence Nightingale, who was a young lady of means, one would describe her, I suppose, as upper middle class. She had every advantage that a young woman of her age and class could enjoy in the middle of the 19th century. But she read all the time in the Times, the London Times, of course, naturally. Was there any other newspaper for an upper-class English woman or a middle-class English woman in the 19th century? She would read all the time of the plight of the soldiers in the Crimea. And she wanted very much to do something about it. Because up until then, most of the so-called nurses who had been present with dying soldiers were no more than what, in the 19th century, were described rather inelegantly as camp followers. they did the best they could for the men. But she wanted to do something professional to prevent the huge number of unnecessary deaths. And so she wrote a letter. She wrote a letter to the Secretary for War. I love the Victorians when they're candid. You know, we think of them as hypocrites, but they really weren't. They could be very candid. I mean, why not have a Secretary for War? Why talk about a Secretary for Defense when you mean war? War! They had a Secretary for War, and she wrote to this man who was a lord, and she said, "My lord," and I've seen this letter. I have actually seen this letter. It was in the possession of my mother. She said, "My lord, prudence," whatever that was in her vocabulary, prudence dictates that I acknowledge the plight of the soldiers in the Crimea. But accept it, I never will. That's one of the most extraordinary sentences written in the 19th century by a woman who was not strong, but who saw injustice, unnecessary death and suffering. She saw it because it was in front of her all the time. The 1850s was an age of popular journalism. We forget the first age of popular journalism before our own civil war. War between the states? Depends which side of the line you live on when you say that. This is in the 1850s. And she says, I acknowledge this. I acknowledge it. I have to. I'm not stupid. I have eyes. I read. I acknowledge this. But I will not accept it. And because of that pronouncement, because of that statement uttered with an uncharacteristic strength from this little woman, she's only 5 feet tall, eventually she was allowed with a corps of women to go to the crowd. You can see today the barracks that she went to back there in the 1850s. It's called Scutori, the Turkish call it. It's still there. It's on the other side of the Bosporus from what used to be Constantinople and is now Istanbul. You can see it. And she went there with her corps of ladies, and despite the opposition of the surgeons and the army doctors who said that in war soldiers die. I mean, who were these soldiers? They were nobodies. In war soldiers die. No, she wouldn't accept that, and she saved hundreds of lives. And in the course of this activity, she founded the profession, the modern profession of nursing, because she acknowledged something that she could not accept. What a remarkable woman. She saw that critical distinction, which we in our own individual lives must somehow discover and apply. There's so much that we acknowledge and are sometimes obliged to acknowledge. But what do we accept? What do we internalize? What do we bring into our consciousness? What do we affirm? What do we proclaim as necessary and essential? There is a distinction, a vivid and powerful and crucial distinction to be made by us. Just last night I was looking at the television. On public television there was a 10-minute segment devoted to Detroit. We've all been told that Detroit is a failed city. It's finished, it's done, it's past, it's crumbling. It's a monument to the futility of the industrial world as it was. That's the perception. That's what we've been taught to acknowledge. But there are people in that city who refuse to accept, absolutely refuse to accept that this is the case. And there is a renaissance taking place in that city through individual effort, through the efforts of people who refuse to accept who refuse to accept what is destructive, negative, and damaging to their entire existence. What an extraordinary example that is. I knew a man called Marcus Bark. Have any of you ever heard of Marcus Bark? One or two of you have. Marcus Bark was a good friend of mine. He was a professor of comparative religions at the University of Iowa. He liked unity. He wrote about unity in a very positive way. And he spent a large part of his professional life traveling the world, looking at the customs of various peoples. He was more anthropologist, I think, than historian. But he had critically examined the power of the curse in many of the societies that he became involved with. Now you may say, oh, well, that's an academic subject. I'm not really interested in that. You know, academics talk to one another after all. But this work of Marcus Bark's actually was of supreme significance because it strengthened this whole view of the distinction between acknowledgement and acceptance. He discovered that those against whom these curses were laid had differing responses. Those who merely acknowledged the curse, maybe it was a verbal curse, or maybe it was an animal's foot laid outside their door, who knows? Those who merely acknowledged this and went on about their life survived. Those who accepted the virulence behind the curse, its intent, those who actually accepted this, internalized the threat, they were the ones who succumbed to sickness, even death, despair. It's all here and here. This is where we often do the acknowledgement, right in here in the mind. But if in the heart we accept what we have acknowledged, merely acknowledged, then a change takes place. What is internalized, what we proclaim begins to manifest in actuality. This is a hugely important lesson. As I said before, it's at the very basis of our unity teaching. Elizabeth and her husband, they acknowledged the unlikelihood of bearing child. And yet because she refused to accept that particular notion, an extraordinary thing happened. She did, in fact, bear the child. Now this, you may say, is a literary conceit. This is nothing more than a myth, a story. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's literally true or not. It never does in wisdom literature. In wisdom literature, you don't ask how. You ask why. Why is this story rooted and seated here in this part of the gospel? Because it's a lesson, it's an article of faith. It tells us that we can acknowledge so much about ourselves, our lives, our circumstances, even our bodies. But it's what we accept that matters. If we accept a situation, if we accept that and internalize it, bring it into ourselves, then of course the possibility of manifestation is heightened to an extraordinary degree. We have this power, this extraordinary power of claiming and manifesting rather than merely observing. And we should be so careful how we exercise this precious gift of God. And now I accept that I must sit down.